Greetings, listeners. Puka here. As mentioned last week, my microphone was not great for this episode, but luckily the issue has been identified and addressed, so hopefully this is the last time, for now at least, that I will be apologizing for the crummy quality of the sound. As for the malevolent spirits hovering around the editing desk, I'll have to invest in a proper exorcism for those, but that's a later problem. On with the show.
This is Changeling the Podcast.
Welcome to Changeling the Podcast. Come for the glamour, stay for the vibes. I'm your host, Josh, and with us is your other host, Puka. Say hi, Puka.
Hey, nunny, hey, nunny, hey.
What are we talking about today, Puka?
We are talking about romance and getting it into your game, or not. Making good decisions.
Mm-hmm. So, romance.
It's a thing.
Yeah, it's a kind of surprisingly taboo topic in role-playing games, it seems like, at least in the general, wider role-playing.
In the general, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so let's hold forth respectively about that. Would you like to start, or shall I?
I'll start. So, first of all, there's romance and there's sexuality, and they can definitely be together, and they can definitely be separate.
Yes.
And you may like one and not the other, or neither. That's fine. But I do find it interesting how much in the general tabletop role-playing game community, I mean, you have D&D's the giant elephant of the room. It's most of role-playing games when you get down to it, but like all the White Wolf games, any game people listening to this have probably played has violence mechanics.
Yeah.
And ways to murder your friends, at least the storyteller characters, that type of thing. Have them possibly murder your character, kill them. And all this damage and injury and all this stuff. And that's all like, oh, that's fine. But you want to have like two people dating, and that's suddenly more taboo. Just dating or kissing or whatever.
Ew.
Yeah. I get some people started when they were like 8 in role-playing games. Maybe that's part of it. But I do think there's things to take into account with romance. You shouldn't be forced to be involved in a romantic plotline or thing in your game if you don't want to be. But I also think that's true for violence plotlines. So
here's two things about that. So, I mean, comment and question. The comment is, obviously we can point to D&D's history as a wargaming miniatures rule set, and it happened to evolve into the genre of role-playing, but fundamentally it is a combat simulator. So it's always been maybe more baked into it than not. Mm-hmm. But then would you also say, and this is where I ask about how the border has influenced our differing perspectives, perhaps, the culture of the US, I would say, is much more comfortable with violence and sexuality compared with places like Europe.
Yeah.
I don't know if Canada's the same.
Canada, maybe it's in between. So we will get something rated, not that we technically have R anymore, but the equivalent of rated R, at least younger. I'm trying to look up what ratings are in Canada these days, and it's confusing. But it's let's just call it rated R or whatever. Would be more likely to show up for violence. So you can have a very violent film in the US that's like PG-13, and it might be R here. And then you can have something with more sexuality and that type of things that would be R in the US and PG-13 equivalent here. So that's definitely, it's not like 100% rule, but yeah, I'd say in general that's how it plays down there.
It just makes me also think about, in the gaming space, as I've alluded to before, the LARPs that I've played have been Nordic LARPs, and two of them, one was about, I don't think it was about losing virginity. I think it was just about first romance at like a school dance. And then one was about polyamory, and they were both really, really intense. And it was an interesting experience, and it was an experience that I'm glad I played in those games. But it was never anything that I had encountered in a tabletop or any kind of role-playing scenario. And it was straight out of Europe. So
well, okay. So if we're going to talk about Nordic LARP, that is to LARPing what certain types of like very indie RPGs are to tabletop.
Yeah. No, I get that. But it was still, that's where I've seen it foregrounded the most. is in that
Yeah.
space. So I don't know. Maybe it's one part culture, one part
Yeah.
historical.
But I've also like I have trouble telling because so many of I did different kinds of LARPing, and a lot of my tabletop experience was with people I met through LARPs. So it gets hard
Hmm.
to for me to tell that. But yeah, the Nordic LARP, European, like we can get into some romance. They're the U.S. and Canada as well, but also a lot of the U.S. has a lot of role playing games in this space too. So
Yeah. And the context for this for Changeling, it does come up a lot. I mean, in the world of darkness as a whole, like
yep,
you see it frequently in Vampire and everything. Well, I'm going to get to that in a minute. But with Changeling, I mean, you have the satyrs, you have the she, you have the swan
hey,
maidens now.
romantic legacies.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's lots of mechanics and stuff baked into it. But then meta plot
Yeah,
wise, the first edition meta plot with the immortal eyes, recall that the main antagonist and the main protagonist were former lovers in Arcadia.
yep,
So you have that relationship as like a key thing in the story. And then moving into second edition, the catalyst is David and Feralith's romance and like
yep.
how that plays into his disappearance. All of that, and I mean, all of the side characters have like their relationships and
Hmm.
hangups or whatever. On top of that, obviously things like courtly love are part of the chivalric
Yep.
apparatus that Changeling leans into, and fairy tales often have tropes around this. So there's a lot of it present, and it is a little bit strange when people kind of go out of their way to avoid it. Strange to me.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, it's really interesting. You're talking about the history of the hobby, like the
yeah,
inspirations of D&D. You go through those. There's a lot of romance and sex and stuff in that too, like the inspirations for D&D.
yeah, oh, for sure.
Even the very chaste, like everything's off screen. You know, marriages of powerful people. Like that's a good chunk of Tolkien. Like that's,
Hmm.
yeah.
Well, Tolkien. Lord of the Rings is a curiously unsexy book. That's a
Well, it's
separate.
unsexy, but there's still like people who have things for each other and they get married
Yeah,
and stuff.
that's true. At the same time, there also does seem to be more conversation happening about this within the tabletop space, and you
Yeah.
do see more games now kind of addressing it. Mage the podcast, shout out to our sibling show, did a recent episode about a book on the subject, the title of which is escaping me at the moment, but it was a very
Hmm.
good episode that will be linked in the show notes. So
Yeah.
clearly, people are thinking about it more.
Yeah, and I think at some point we should. There's a bunch of other RPGs that and authors I want to highlight, but
Yeah.
too. But yeah,
Perhaps before diving in more fully,
yeah,
content warning.
yeah,
We are going to be talking about romance and sexuality and some of the bad behaviors to avoid, so consider yourself warned.
yeah. And if you want a content warning for the entire series, like we're both queer, so
Yeah,
and we've never hid that. So if you
FYI.
somehow have a problem with that and are listening now, you can turn us off if you'd like. But
Yes. Don't let the door hit you where the Lord split you.
yeah,
Part of my motivation for this episode, at least, comes from flipping through the recent release for Vampire 5th Edition, Bloodstained Love, and just wincing one too many times. Have you read
mm,
it, by the way? Have you seen this?
no. If you came across a Vampire Fifth Edition at this point, from everything from first reading a bit of the core book and then just all the stuff that's happened and all that, if you told me, "Oh, here's a great Fifth Edition Vampire book," you'd have trouble convincing me to read it. So when you say it's
Okay.
terrible, I'm not gonna go out.
I mean, all right. I haven't
Yeah,
done like a page by page review deep
yeah,
read, so I'm going to give it some benefit of the doubt. But what I will say is that on cursory examination, the
yeah.
ratio of potentially problematic to guardrails was too imbalanced for my liking.
Hmm.
And I don't think we're going to necessarily solve that kind of dilemma in this episode, but I think we
Yeah,
can at least try to give some tips and advice. So,
yeah. So step one: listen to our session 0 episode, where
yes.
we get into, in general, how to make sure the chronicle will work for everyone at the table, storyteller and players. And one important thing to highlight on that is, I mean, there's a few things. Hey, there's going to be romance in this game. Hey, there's going to be sexy times in this game. Hey, like, what does that mean? Everyone needs to understand and be okay with that.
Yes.
And if they're not, you need to either change what the chronicle's about or change that person being in the chronicle. Like that's fundamental. Don't go forward if people don't want to do this.
Yeah.
But there's other things like I think lines and veils is especially. It's a one safety tool that's very useful for this type of situation. Lines, or you're like, this just should never come up in the chronicle. Veils, I think, is very important for this,
Yes.
where you say the things that it can happen in your chronicle, like in terms of you would say this thing happened, but it's not going to be described. It's not going to be on screen, quote unquote, right? Like sex would often. I don't know how many groups I want to do graphic sex scenes with at the table.
I think I have yet to meet such a group.
I've done it, so I can't say I haven't met such a group, but
Yeah.
I would definitely not do it as a con game. Let's put it that way.
No. Just to kind of return to the distinction between romance and sexuality.
Yep.
It is important to determine all right, backing up even further. You have lines and veils, but before you even get to the lines and veils, you assess the comfort level of your players around those two things separately.
Yep.
And we've talked on that Session Zero episode about the tools that you can use to do that, whether it's just having a conversation, whether it's a free response form, whether it's using an actual sheet with checkboxes or whatever. I was thinking of it almost in terms of like a 1 through 5 scale, like intensity wise, kind of to go back to the movie ratings, like from G through X, and that is part of.
What's an X-rated romance?
All right, that's marriage. That's full on marriage.
You're gonna depict. We can't depict marriage here, but we can only have dating.
My parents used to do, when it was tax season, they had like all the receipts and documents laid out on the kitchen table for like a solid week. And that to me was like the most high octane version of a relationship I'd have ever seen. Just turned me off to the whole concept, though. Anyway.
I think being sick in front of each other is the highest.
But because some people are going to be fine with like graphic sex and not with relationships, and vice versa. Yeah. So,
and there's fine with other characters doing it versus your character doing it.
Right. That exactly. So you have to account for it for everybody at the table and go with the.
Yeah. And even then, there's also like consensuality and what people see as consent, because consent's important, but it's not simple. And yeah.
Oh, I might have alluded to this experience before, but I was playing over lockdown in a vampire game on an open world server on Discord. And my character, I forget how, I think it was like a very Craven thing. It was like, my character wants to get a dot of auspex. You have to drink the blood of a vampire who has auspex in order to do that. Vampires drinking blood is described in canon as being this very intensely personal and often erotic act. So the other player and I, we talked about it, and we were like, first they were like, oh yeah, it's cool if you want to like set up this scene of like the sharing blood. But then we talked about it and we were like, wouldn't it be, let's have them actually have a meet cute. Let's do it. And it was a queer romance, and it was very, I mean, we thought it was hilarious. Like, it was fun and it was silly, and we didn't take it seriously at all. But then people started shipping our characters, and it got weird. And it wasn't like, thankfully the server collapsed not long after, but I had never been in that kind of situation before. And it was just this like kind of uncomfortable thing. So when it comes to consent, obviously you need consent from your players to take part in a romantic or sexual subplot or scene, but also no player should feel like any other player's relationship is their business unless they are invited to weigh in. And that's, I think, an aspect of consent that doesn't always get addressed.
Although that gets extra thin line or touchy, whatever, with the storyteller as a player.
Well, yeah. And I mean, that's, I'm just saying it has to be part of the conversation. In the same way that you probably wouldn't, I would hope, butt your way into someone else's personal relationship business in real life.
Yeah.
Don't necessarily do that in a game with a character.
I mean, talk to the player, and if everyone's cool with it, your character,
sure,
but that's a different story.
And your character may be a jerk. Your character may say or do something untoward, but it is something that needs to be part of the negotiation.
Yep.
And part of the reason for that, another topic that we should address here, is bleed. The idea that what impacts the character can impact the player and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
Because the last thing you want is for like a romance between characters to impact your friendship or relationship with a player.
Certainly in a bad way. You don't want.
Yeah. Or even an unexpected way. I mean,
Well, I mean, maybe you want.
well, listen, I'm not going to say don't go looking for partners in a gaming group, but I'm
No,
also
I'm not saying gaming, but there is a difference between bleed and like bleed can mean a lot of things. Like
yeah.
you may feel what your character's feeling. That's not the same as you have that relationship now with the player. I guess.
Yeah.
Putting it right, and you need to manage bleed for sure.
You need to be very conscious of it, of
Yeah.
what's crossing that line between player and character.
Yep.
My gripe about Bloodstained Love the book is that I don't feel they give enough guidance on that, because there is I think there's like a page or maybe two in like the first chapter somewhere, and then maybe a sidebar somewhere else. And then it's the other 140 pages, because it's vampire. A lot of the sexuality is deeply problematic or manipulative or abusive. Plus the fact that the book outright suggests at one point, oh, you can run a solo session for your partner as a form of erotic foreplay. And I'm thinking, not with vampire, I'm not. Good lord.
Well,
But
again, what you want to do in your own privacy of your bedroom is
sure,
but,
that's me.
yeah.
I'm not here to yuck anyone's yum, but
Yeah.
everyone I think needs to be completely above board about it and hit the brakes as soon as there's any sign of discomfort from any party. And I think that, you know, shoveling on all of these options for like how to do sexy gaming and then being very minimal about how to be careful about it is, you know.
I do think, like, this is about romance and sexuality. I do think in the US and Canada, with a fair number of cishet vanilla people, maybe going down the romance road might be easier. But like, you still need to do all this stuff, but like it might just be easier to less minds to walk around that minefield.
Yeah.
But there's still some, for sure. And like you could have a like just emotionally intimate scene, and you're talking about bleed, that could still be an issue. And if it's like two monogamous people and the players are two monogamous people in different relationships and they've done this and now there's question anyway, still need to have this conversation.
There's a really good book by Gail Rubin that's kind of a classic of gender and sexuality studies called Thinking Sex, from like the mid 80s. And one of her concepts is what she calls the charmed circle, primarily about sexuality, but I think it applies to romance as well. And she talks about how the forms that are accepted by society are within that circle. Every aspect that you look at forms kind of a binary or a pairing with stuff outside the circle that is seen as wrong or divergent or problematic in some way. So like heterosexuality on the inside versus non-heterosexuality on the outside, monogamy versus polygamy, like these kinds of pairings that we make, the we as a broad society.
Yep.
And I think that I almost wonder if that would be a good tool, like at a session 0, to kind of say, like, here are all of the things that are conventionally accepted. Which ones are you okay with going outside the box on? Because you want to be sensitive to the social norms and the cultural ideologies that people have. I mean, you may want to challenge them as well, but you also want to be clear about your expectations and what they're comfortable with. Whether that's about queerness, whether that's about kink, whether that's about various forms of relationship that are non-standard.
And you need to have this with everybody, but the less you know someone, especially in this space of sexuality and romance, I guess the more you need to really make clear, like the fundamental steps, I guess, if that makes any sense. Like if you don't already have the shared understanding.
And never assume you have the shared understanding.
No. But I mean, you may at some point I've definitely had it where I'm trying to use these safety tools and people are like, we've negotiated outside of role-playing games much more problematic stuff. Why are we doing this for role-playing? So,
well, I know that you've talked about your uncertainty about certain forms of safety tool, like in terms of having the checklist and stuff. So do you think what do you think is the best strategy for kind of addressing?
I think you need to absolutely tailor it to the specific people at the group, at the table.
Have you found something that's worked particularly well for you?
Well, I think you have to tailor it for everybody who's at the table.
Is there any particular instance where you had a tool that worked really well?
No, well, I do find lines and veils. You write down things,
Okay.
doing some coming up with X card stuff, but like having people volunteer it. But it really depends on the social context. Like even I did it once on a Discord server, like got people to play in the game. It was like some one person I knew in person and some other people from a Discord server, but I knew the people on the Discords. So it's like it shaped the conversation that we were
Mhm.
going to have. And if I had done it instead by getting a role playing game together by posting at the local gaming store and people I never knew were starting to play, or if I had done it more broadly, bringing people together, I would probably need more of a conversation first before even starting that conversation. Like you need
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
to make sure we know when we're saying these things that we mean the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to weed out the obvious sociopaths. That's also
I mean, the obvious sociopaths maybe, but
yeah,
there's definitely non-obvious sociopaths that are hard to, you're never going to
absolutely.
catch them all. But that's a whole other story.
Something else that occurs to me when it comes to romance versus sexuality, because I think people, even if they are like, "Oh no, this is fine. I don't care. Like, I don't need lines and veils, whatever."
Okay, if somebody says it's fine, I don't care, I don't need safety tools,
Well,
then you need safety tools for sure.
yes.
I think a one size fit all safety tools. The problem that I have. Yeah.
No, no. What I was going to say, just I think people know what to expect with sexuality because things like movies have kind of primed us for that. You know, it's like pornography. I'll know it when I see it. Romance, I think, is weirdly the trickier one because I think people aren't necessarily as primed to think about bleed and to think about those things. So, like, if I were to have a conversation with players about this at session zero, I think sexuality would be much more a ticking of the boxes.
Oh, you mean just obvious what it is that you are doing sexuality versus is this even romance, this scene? Is that what you're saying?
Well,
Or?
no, I think that with romance, because it can get much more integrated into a character arc. Not that sexuality can't, but I feel like
Yeah.
sexuality is much more often it happens and then it's over, like the scene starts and ends, whereas romance kind of is ongoing. And I think that that's a more subtle, deeper kind of way that players can be impacted by it.
Hmm.
But I don't know. I mean, everyone's different. Romance also I think of as kind of being more well, there's a lot of overlap. I tend to think of romance as being more of a performative social interaction than sexuality usually is. And
Oh. Oh, I don't think that at all.
well, in the context of a game. I
Oh,
mean,
okay. I mean, everything in the game's a performative social.
well, but I feel like when romance comes up in a game, it's much more its consequences tend to be longer lasting and more pervasive, if that makes sense. I'm trying to think of how to articulate it.
Like, it tends to get more full plot lines, do you mean? Like ongoing?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay.
because like if a sex scene happens, I mean, partially because it is usually happening off stage.
Yeah.
It more often feels like, well, in some cases, a means to an end, or just kind of an accessory to something else that's happening. Whereas romance takes a more central role more often.
Yeah. But I mean, yeah, it's creating a deeper relationship. Like just, I think I said before that like this is not romance. I'm comparing to romance. Like having the player characters be family, right?
Mm. Hmm.
And if you're like siblings or whatever, right? You have a connection there that is going to be pervasive. I guess you're not forming it mid game usually, although I guess marriage counts as that. But that can also like yeah, there's definitely there's different types of interpersonal relationships, all of which I think are probably in most role playing tables not very coming up very much. But
Of all things, the game where I've seen it kind of handled most directly in a, I guess, sort of changeling adjacent way is Pendragon
I was
because
about to say that yeah, that's that explicit generational stuff and
oh no, I meant the courtly love mechanics, and I do mean
okay
mechanics because they have
yeah
the amour passion, which is different from the love passion.
Mm.
That's a very performative romance, you know.
So when you're doing your storyteller vault, porting Pendragon Courtly Love into Changeling.
Yeah. That to me is the level 5 romance and level 0,
Yeah.
or at least in principle level 0 sexuality, because it's
Yeah.
like you're getting your libido out by poetry and having your lady tie her
Yep.
ribbon around your phallic symbol or whatever, you know, so that she'll show you her
Yeah.
ankle, that kind of
I
thing.
do. I don't get the impression the she do that though in Changeling. If you're gonna
I get the impression the Gwydion do.
really, I think they still make it less.
They're still boning? Yeah, maybe.
It's still less. It's not always level 0 sexuality.
Yeah. Well, in any case, they are more in tune with that thread of the myths, and it's a
Yeah.
very Arthurian kind of thing, like to have that patriarchal adultery adjacent sort of romance.
Yep.
None of that's necessary. Like, I think it would actually be really interesting to explore different forms of courtly love outside of what we get in Noble's The Shining Host.
Yeah.
So, and certainly both romance and sexuality can be physical and emotional to different degrees. Both are about
Mm-hmm.
desire of different kinds. So they do co-occur in a lot of ways. So separating them out for the sake of determining what people are into might not always be possible.
Yeah, but I mean that's if everyone's being upfront and yeah, it's the kind of thing maybe you do need to trigger your X card or whatever
Yeah.
at some point because you're like, no, this actually did cross what I thought was.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with a retroactive veto either. If you
Absolutely.
went, oh, that scene that was not right.
Consent can be revoked.
Yeah, you're all just trying to create a shared thing. If someone went, I don't like that happened.
Hit the undo button.
Yep.
Yeah. In terms of the stories, because, you know, thinking about how romance ties into a plot on that subject, let's transition here to talking about this. There's, I guess you could call it, two different axes of differentiation. Romance as a central plot versus a subplot, and then having it be part of the table story versus an individual character story. So, like, you know, if there's some kind of relationship that's like the focus of the entire group's efforts versus like, oh, it's just kind of a side thing that is involved with one storyteller character. And then is it something that everybody is involved in or just one character is involved in, one player?
Mm-hmm.
So hashing that out is something that a storyteller should do. But also, I like to find connective tissue between them. So even though I'm saying don't horn in on somebody else's relationship in a game, from a story
Yeah.
building perspective, I do like to find little connections. I think it can make for good motivation without getting into problematic tropes
Well,
like,
and there's a difference between horning in and politely asking.
yeah. But I also want to avoid the sort of things like women in refrigerators, you know? Like,
Yeah, don't. You're the fun thing with a relationship is to me in a story like the best way to use a relationship is to have it continue to be some kind of relationship. Now, it could be a breakup, like you, and then
yeah,
now it's like, oh, now you're dealing with that your exes, and that's also a new kind of relationship that might be hostile, but it's still there. If somebody, everything aside from other issues with fridging, like if somebody's dead, there's now no longer a interaction and a relationship to continue forward. Well, barring Wraith crossover and the
yeah.
like.
Something else that I've seen, which can be a major issue if it's not kind of, if you're not aware of it and if it's not handled right, you may have a player who has like trauma as part of their character's backstory. It's a motivation for some aspect of who they are, whether it's an assault or something else. And if you, as the storyteller, are aware of it, you want to make clear to that player that not everyone else at the table may be okay with that. And if they want to have their character informed by that piece of their past, it has to be something that you negotiate privately with them. You know, because it's like, I don't want to tell someone, no, you can't make that choice for your character's backstory. Because if they have this concept that's informed by that, that's their concept.
Mm-hmm.
But I also don't want them to like bring it up at a table where it's going to trigger somebody. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I agree that there are lots of other productive, less trauma based ways to like bring this in. So Why not go with those instead? Maybe a character falls in love with the Motley's enemy. Maybe the enemy has abducted a character's lover. Maybe there's a political angle. Maybe actually, political
Yeah.
angle. That story from Anthology of Dreams with the what is it, the Leon and She who's supposed to like marry the one person, but then accidentally sleeps with somebody at a party, so it might derail the
Yep.
negotiation. I loved that.
Yep.
That was like
That felt so Shannon McGuire to me, by the way, if you're trying to get you to read those her books.
someday. But that to me is a good example of how you can like find these crossover points between a private relationship, like a relationship that's just part of one character's story, and turning it into something that everybody is to different degrees aware of and involved in.
Yeah.
Because it has consequences that go beyond the relationship itself.
Yep. And yeah, when you have groups of friends and even coworkers, if people are connected and there's different kinds of relationships, not necessarily romantic, but if you're all tied together in various kinds of relationships and a new one forms there, it impacts everybody in a way.
Yeah. I was in a Changeling game where one of our allies, a mortal ally, had an autumn person boyfriend. So we spent an inordinate amount of time trying to break them up using all the cantrips at our disposal. So you can get into the individual aspects of any of these, but I think it's good to find ways to tie it into what the rest of the group cares about so that it doesn't feel like someone's relationship is becoming a spectator sport.
Yeah, don't just start writing fanfic about other characters. I think it's a good rule.
Yeah, it was weird.
Yeah, that reminds it's a little bit different. It reminds me when people start writing actor fanfic as opposed to character fanfic.
Yeah. So in terms of tropes, like what are some particular changeling flavored ones? I mean, there's satyrs. There's just satyrs
all over the place. Boggins. There's a lot of boggin. The matchmaking.
That's
aspect.
true. Yeah.
And then we brought up all the courtly love stuff with She and
Selkies.
Yeah, there's also like several kiths where it's like the romance brings out a different side in them, like trolls and slua and knockers and
redcaps.
Yeah, showing a different aspect of your character that would not normally fit with the kith, but it sort of does when you see them in a relationship.
That story in the first edition player's guide with the redcap in love is still one of the most wholesome things that has ever happened.
Yep. So you can do the whole like this is a different. It doesn't have to be kith based only, but like you can use romance to show a different side of a character, PC or NPC, or major NPC, I guess. But PC definitely, where you're like that might be a reason why you have them now dating an NPC if there's no for various reasons wouldn't have them date a PC, another PC. You can still have that and like showing a different side of them or like what they're like with their partner and how it's different from with the rest of the group potentially. Doesn't mean they have to be different, but I mean that's a thing you could do.
So I think this episode will be coming out before our third installment of the C20 Player's Guide.
Yep.
But the Swan Maidens.
Yeah, they're
a whole mood.
I know some people love them. I don't hate them, but I have questions. It seems a bit too intense for one thing.
Yeah, just in terms of like what we are discussing in this episode, because if you do a Swan Maiden, it's kind of like your entire character has to be structured around a particular kind of a relationship. And I don't know, it just strikes me as difficult to make that work unless the game in its entirety is also kind of structured around it.
Yeah, if you're doing one of those open world servers and somebody's playing a Swan Maiden and there's other things that don't even know they're a changeling and they start dating someone, I think that's a big don't let that happen.
Yeah.
What is it, Dark Fate or something when they like their partner will die within 7 days or something? Like
something like that, yeah. It's a whole thing.
Maybe just say the relationship ends horribly. Like
well, and you also have I mean, because it is a trope, right? Like the Swan Maiden.
Yeah.
Because the Swan Maiden trope is something in the lore, and it does make me think about other kiths and other fae where that's the case, like the Selkies, for example. The idea of the Selkie's spouse is such a strong concept.
But I like that because it's coming like on an angle. Like there's no flaw or whatever in the Selkie write-up that says it has to happen. It's just the nature of the Selkie means long term there's going to be major problems.
Yeah.
Right?
There's also the trope of the romantic muse. Oh, the Aunids we didn't even talk about, who can get glamour through sex, but that's a thing. So yeah, there are options that are grounded in myth that the game sort of facilitates. I would say I almost feel like there are three buckets. There's the stuff that's inspired by the actual legends that is worked into mechanics to various degrees or worked into Kith write-ups to various degrees. There is standard immortal romance stuff that the players themselves will be experienced with that they can project onto their characters. And then I feel like there's a third bucket, and I'm not sure what's in it, but it interests me.
Yeah.
And I feel like that Redcap and Love story was an example of it.
Yeah.
And I don't know what else to
Well,
call it.
this is feeling like, weirdly, this ties into our science fiction episode. It's taking something fantastic and exploring the realistic consequences, or at least the in-depth, real seeming consequences.
Yeah,
Like, it's
okay.
not just, oh, you have a red cap. It's, what would that actually mean if they dated someone? And, yeah. What would a realistic red cap dating look like? And that could be interesting. I will say, with the tropes, going back to the whole safety and discussion and everything, way too often in role-playing games I've encountered, and I've been guilty of this, where you go, oh, it's a trope. Oh, it's in the myth. Oh, it's in the book. And then you think that that means it's fine.
Yeah.
You need to really examine stuff.
Yeah.
Like, just because it says that, or just because it's tied to the lore or tied to the folklore or whatever, like, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a thing that should happen at this table.
Yeah.
Or maybe you need to figure this out, or figure out how to make it happen at this table.
Yeah, because a lot of the myths and legends that these things are connected to are in and of themselves problematic and reflect systems that are detrimental to a lot of people.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Don't do Sleeping Beauty without examining it.
No, absolutely not.
Yep.
But even like Cinderella, I mean,
Yep.
any of these princess stories. What are some other things in Changeling to consider here, though? I have Nobles the Shining Host open. I have the list of romantic legacies.
I still don't know what to do with those. It never really told us. That was my biggest problem with that system was it didn't really feel like a system. It just pointed at being one, but
Yeah.
So, like, I don't know how to use it because it doesn't tell you.
It's just an extra thing on the character sheet.
Yeah.
Well, I can very quickly read them off. If people want to use them, the Sealy ones are Empath, Friend, Ingenue, Jongleur, Protector, and Romantic. Jongleur, for the record, which is French for juggler, is you like to keep your lovers and yourself entertained. Love is the greatest joy and should be enjoyed to its fullest. Sure.
I love that one of the romantic legacies is romantic.
Right. German style, I guess. Philosophical romantic.
Yeah.
The unseelie ones are Climber, as in social climber, Competitor, Cynic, Deceiver, Martyr, Gamester, and Spy. A lot of these are problematic, and anyone who does these in real life is probably not a great person. So
Yeah.
I also dislike this not exactly a system because it portrays the unseelie as like the gaslighters and the narcissists, like all of the really awful things.
Yeah, there's many things to go, this is a problem.
Yeah. The Orders of the Heart, which are like political affiliations but about love, are maybe a little bit more interesting because you have the Order of Shalott, who believes in the noblest aspects of pure love. You have the Cyrenaics, who are sensualists who are hungry for any type of stimulus, and the Ascetics, who are the opposite of that, very chaste love. That I could see turning into something you could actually use more substantively in a game. And I'm focusing on this book because this is where most of it is.
Yep.
It does also talk about Dream Assault, which not really something that needs to be in your game.
Yeah, although now we have Oneiromancy. But,
yeah.
Anyway.
Well, there's like the Gankener too and everything who preys sexually on humans and fail, like it says. You have things like the appearance trait to think about. You have things like the charisma trait. Magic. There is actually, I do really like the note on page 66 of Nobles the Shining Host. It says, two changelings who seem, to outside eyes, to be merely facing each other, perhaps holding hands or stroking each other's cheek, may in reality be exploring unbounded realms of pleasure. And I like that. The idea of using cantrips to enhance pleasure as something that changelings do, I'm okay with
Yeah,
that.
that's the thing. Because it's a role playing game, there's like this idea like everything's very utilitarian in cantrips, but
Yeah, we have the cantrips and then we have unleashings. We don't have just like a level 0 tickle somebody with the summer art kind of thing.
well,
And that would be, you know,
one day we'll do an episode on Nobilis. Would they have something like that? But
there you go.
we can talk about how to incorporate it.
Yeah. All that being said, going back to consent and safety, there are cantrips around emotional and mental manipulation. This is something which can be very triggering for people. Please remember to include it on your topics for discussion, particularly if
Mhm.
someone's going to take like Chicanery 5 or Summer 5, you know.
Yep.
I think those are the ones we have to worry about now. What else? You have other dots on the sheet options. You have the true love merit. I think there might be other merits and flaws that kind of.
Well, one thing that Changeling actually brought up a lot, and sometimes is the past lives background.
Yeah, yeah.
You're an ex in a former life, or maybe you died in each other's arms or whatever, and now you're living different lives. And what does that mean now that you've met each other?
Well, if you're David, it means that your lover is now your sister. So,
Yeah, yeah, and she picked their hosts, so
oh, not a great.
they're the dreams of nobility. That's a
Fair enough. You can also just have it as backgrounds, like having allies or having dreamers who are
Mhm.
relationships of one kind or another.
Yep.
There's the Oath of True Hearts with the little chimerical birds.
Mhm. I love that. Oh my god! Did I tell you? I in a LARP, Changeling LARPs, I knew someone playing in that first Changeling LARP I was in after a few years. She had like the sad bird on her shoulder, like it's
Oh,
part of her character costume.
I think you did mention, yeah.
That was so
That's
funny.
like a deep cut.
Yeah,
both both emotionally and in the source material, that's a deep cut, but I like it.
like the first time you see her character, she's got that. So it's like
Oh, good on
just
her.
like someone else had like the cross blades on the that's less romance, but had
Yeah,
the broke the oath of blades, whatever.
yeah. Anyway, there are
Yeah,
options,
I,
and
I want to bring up a few other role playing games.
go for it.
Okay, so there's what's called the Romance Trilogy by Emily Carebass, and this isn't the only romance game she wrote, but she wrote a bunch of things, which is like Breaking the Ice. It's a game about two characters fall in love and stay together at their first three dates. Shooting the Moon, a love triangle game about two suitors vie for the love of shared beloved. Under My Skin, which is a LARP about people falling in love with all the wrong people, a bit like a Midsummer's Night Dream feeling. There's Alex Roberts. She wrote several games, but her biggest one and the one that's most applicable here, I think, is Starcrossed. It's a two-player game involving a Jenga tower for resolution, and it's based on a horror game that used a Jenga tower, but she modified it heavily. And one of the rules is like while talking to each other, you have to be touching the tower, and you're like pulling pieces when you do certain moves in the relationship. And when it falls, the characters must be two people who are not supposed to be together. And when it falls, that comes to a head. And I think that's awesome.
Can you combine that with like the sexy Jenga towers that are out there in novelty stores?
Yeah, I mean, it's supposed to be the build up to the sexy time, but maybe. But apparently, a lot like she was saying, like a lot of people who've never played role playing games before,
Hmm.
but from like the romance novel community and stuff, like absolutely loved it. So
Interesting.
yeah, and then two other games. There's Thirsty Sword Lesbians by
Yes.
April Walsh. All right, that's actually it's definitely got a lot of romance and sexy time stuff in it.
It's a modern
And then
classic.
another one is Monster Hearts by Avery Alder,
Hmm.
which is a very World of Darkness inspired, not only by World of Darkness, but it's definitely one of the inspirations of like high school game where like each player character plays a different kind of monster in the high who's going to high school, and all the relationship fallout and things like that, and has interesting relationship mechanics around strings. And when I say relationship, I mean it very broadly, not just dating, but there's definitely dating's part of it and other stuff. So I just wanted to highlight those four games if you want more of different ways of doing romance, and it might give you inspirations on things for your changeling games as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and ultimately, in the same way that every changeling game for every table is going to be different, the way that romance and sexuality and relationships are handled are going to be completely different. So drawing on those other sources to look for possibilities, I think, is a wise move.
Yeah. Yeah. By the way, we just got another listener question.
Oh, yeah, we had a couple comments I didn't
Yeah.
see. Let's see. So moving to those, the Wayfaring Stranger comments, I ran a game with romance in it, and 2 of the players were dating redcaps. Yay! The she actually fixed him. I don't know what that's supposed to mean. The satyr got made worse. The troll and the boggin were the most wholesome ones, and ironically, the clericon, not the satyr, had relationship issues with the puka. I don't know. I think a clericon could have relationship issues pretty
I
easily.
think this sounds like a great story. So that's
Yeah. And then Van Eck says, I once played a boggin who had a intimate relation with her dreamers, and she eventually ended up with an almost autumn person she and the motley turned into a dreamer. I don't know. I feel like given how fairy tales and muses tend to go, it's a good example of what changelings can end up with.
Yeah. There's something we didn't get into. Relationships and sexuality as quests. There's another.
Oh. I mean, that I feel like does come up often enough in media.
Yeah.
Sometimes with comical results that you can try and like. I mean, Super Mario Brothers is one of those.
Yep. But also thinking of the quest in terms of like that is part of it. Like one of the quests in C20 is like turning a high banality person into a dreamer. But
Yeah.
that's it from well, beyond just not playing with them, how does one navigate the player who thinks that the time should never be spent on romance and RPGs? I suspect that Changeling may have had some social tools built in the game that lend themselves to easing some of the cons in a way that isn't inherently messed up from the start. One not need look for the comment section of any podcast episode for romance and RPGs, such as Maze the Podcast episode, to see folks into this persuasion. So, I mean, there's a lot of ways to go with this, but one is they don't have to play in your game.
Yeah.
That's a big problem. If you want to have a game focused on something with other players who want to have a focus in them, and one person just doesn't want that to happen in the Chronicle at all, I think maybe shouldn't be in the Chronicle. I mean, it depends on this hypothetical person based on comment section. Maybe they just don't want to do romance themselves, but they're okay with other characters doing it. In which case, fine. Or maybe they're complaining that it's not like a dungeon crawl constantly. In which case, that is a problem. Like it. But we've talked about you want to discuss it, and maybe they can be part of the game, and maybe they can't. It really takes a discussion with them and figuring out what they want from the Chronicle is compatible with what everyone else wants, which is also what you should do in real relationships, by the way.
Yeah.
Sexual romantic before getting into those, but
hopefully, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I kind of raise an eyebrow at people commenting on podcast episodes about the topic because, like the Mage the podcast episode, I thought was very well done and very nuanced.
Yeah, I haven't read the comments, so I don't know like what the comment they're referencing. So maybe it's
more than in Mage, like for Changeling specifically, to say, oh, well, this has no place being a role-playing game, where are you even talking about it? It is everywhere in Changeling.
Yeah.
I mean, repeatedly, probably almost every book has something about a relationship gone wrong or a relationship as a motivation for a character.
Yeah.
So it's very present.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe there's not tools, but it isn't as inherently problematic as Vampire. I'll give it that.
Yes. Anyway.
So yeah, I think we've addressed that in the question, but
yeah, I mean, similar to if someone has a problem with it, they don't need to play at the table. If someone has a problem with it being in the game at all, they don't have to listen to this episode.
Yeah, they don't have to play Changeling if they really don't want that, or if the whole group wants to do something without romance and sex, or either or both in your Changeling Chronicle, and your group just doesn't want to do it. That's fine too, right? But you are cutting out something that there's been a lot of word count for in Changeling. So,
yep.
Okay.
Thus endeth.
Yeah. So, if you want to let us know why we shouldn't be talking about romance and sex in Changeling, you can send us an email, podcast@changelingthepodcast.com.
Don't actually.
No,
talk to us if you have more constructive things.
If you want to say horrible things about us, please do it on YouTube, Changeling the Podcast, and write the horrible comments there, because that drives up our engagement numbers and will help us get out more fully. So that only complain about us on YouTube.
Right on.
But if you want to talk about us or have more in-depth, probably the most back and forth involved conversation should be through our Discord, discord.me/CTP. You can also go to our Facebook group, Changeling the Podcast. You can also send us a toot on Mastodon, changelingpod@dice.camp. You can leave us a comment on our website, changelingthepodcast.com. You can join our Patreon, changelingthepodcast.com, help support us there, and you can message us there.
Yay!
And
links to all of these will be in the show notes to this episode.
And once again, I'm Josh.
I remain Puka.
I think I better go do something romantic for my husband after him putting up with me being away for this double recording.
Make love, not war.
This episode is sponsored by the Boggin Matchmakers Association of Concordia, bringing together since time immemorial the lovelorn Fiona Knight in need of someone to slay dragons for, and the gender-fluid Pisky courtesan with a costume for every occasion, the lumpen troll with a heart of gold, and the slua with a prehensile tongue, and sometimes all four at once, in the same rose-petal-strewn hotel room meet-cute. The BMA's services are charged on a case-by-case basis using a sliding scale ranging from the kindness of their hearts to an actual arm and leg, though it is possible a redcap snuck into the meeting for the latter. If you are in need of some romance, requited or otherwise, or simply a no-strings roll in the hay, the BMA promises a dalliance in 1/3 the time of any competitor or your barter back. For all your other Fae-flavored needs, consider stopping by our Discord at www.discord.me/CTP to join in the many concurrent conversations. We also appreciate signups on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/changelingthepodcast. And herewith our usual shout-out of thanks to those who have directed some support our way. Anarchist, Derek, Dorcatus, Elorus, Iabol, Oreo, Razcaboose, Sandchicker, Sija, Terry Robinson, Tricerabeth, and Victor Torre. Please feel free to also leave a review on the podcast listening platform of your greatest convenience and or tell your lovers, partners, and hate f***s all about the show. With that, it remains only for us to encourage you to stay safe and love strong, and until next time, keep on dreaming.